Hey guys and girls, thanks for tuning into episode 10 here with my coach, friend, and mentor, Mr. Jeffery of Physique Collective, talking everything to do with female enhancement practices and what to look for and how to mitigate side effects. So, hopefully, you guys enjoy this chat as much as I did. Enjoy.
Nutrition, lifestyle, and PED education. This is the Elite Strength Podcast with Aaron Scoffey.
Hey guys and girls, welcome to the Elite Strength Podcast, episode 10 here with my coach and friend, Mr. Jeffery, all the way from the UK. How are you, sir?
I'm not too bad, bro. Do you know what? I'm going to apologize ahead of time if I'm a bit slow on this one because I'm actually normally asleep now.
These are like, yeah, what is it? 10 past 9?
It's 10 past 9, yeah. So I'm normally in bed at 9.
Yeah. Well, it's 10 past 6 here in the morning. So I'm already up and had half a modafinil and I've got my coffee ready to go. So my day's already started. We're ready to go.
On opposite sides of the spectrum. I took 10 milligram of melatonin about 10 minutes ago. So.
This podcast is now done and he's going to go to bed.
Right, that's exactly right. Yeah.
But we won't try and keep you too long, good sir. I think today's topic, we just wanted to talk about female enhancement, really. A topic I know I've heard a ton of podcasts and we've spoken obviously behind or off camera quite a few times about female enhancement practices and potentially not needing to use AAS or anabolic steroids to elicit growth and probably using a few other more safer, I guess, measures, even though we can never really classify this as 100% safe in what we do, but we can make it as safe as possible. So just wanted to branch into that and see what other ideas we could go through and, maybe better ways about it.
Yeah, so the fundamental basis behind this model is that women, alongside the elderly and children, are androgen sensitive individuals. We would rather stay as far away from androgen use with the female as possible, not discounting their anabolism and anti-lipogenesis and all of the wonderful things that they do. And I'm not discounting that they can be, maybe should be, maybe have to be used at times. The discussion is around how do we minimize their use but still make very robust physique improvements? How do we minimize their use and still bring the condition to the stage that we need to? And how do we make those periods that we do use them? Good start, isn't it? How do we make those periods that we do use them? What's the terminology I'm looking for here? The most productive time of their use. So I'm talking about synergistic and permissive relationships with them, essentially, at that point. I also understand that it's very easy for somebody to hear me speak on this and say, it's all well and good saying that, but this happens. I understand that for a little bit of like credibility and anecdote. I do coach professional bikini athletes, wellness athletes, figure athletes, and they do well. So this isn't just like, I do have to put that aside in there as well, that, this is a model that I not only preach, but do also execute with good effect as well in women. So essentially the way that this would go is framing our anabolic use at the bottom of the tree in terms of drug selection. And then when we get there, looking at things that potentially express the least amount of androgenicity per milligram of androgen exposure, have the greatest tissue selectivity to skeletal muscle specifically, and then essentially working under those permissive and synergistic relationships to minimize the total milligrams of exposure and duration of exposure, right?
Yep.
So that's probably the model in a nutshell.
Yeah. So when we do look at, I guess, the milligram to kilogram type model, even though we know that blood work's obviously always going to be the best way to go about it, trying to standardize it or I guess people trying to standardize it way back sort of did a decent job, but the milligram to kilogram model for females, is that still applicable? Because we know we have these sort of basic sort of reference ranges for, a TRT, HRT for males, and then obviously sort of a maximum or a higher threshold for anabolism when it comes to like bodybuilding and, being an elite pro type scenario. But when it comes to females, it's completely different. So what do we look at for females when it comes to this sort of ratio and that sort of thing?
It's interesting that you mentioned the milligram per kilogram per X amount of time discussion here. This is a discussion that's happening among educators at the minute, and I think it's a good discussion.
So I thought I'd bring it up.
I think it's worth talking about. So where the proposed model of tracking blood work and titrating fails here is that we cannot get blood work for blood primobolan or something, or what's my blood masteron level, to segue that argument as well. This is why I am a fan of just straight up bioidentical testosterone for women in the right scenario, because it does offer us that benefit of a very clear analysis and assessment and therefore adjustment point of the total milligrams and how that reflects as a blood serum. But the milligram per kilogram model is something that I would still use in women. I would start at a lower end. Let's give a real example. I use 0.5 milligram per kilogram per week. It's usually where I would begin a female with their androgen use. And the rest we could base down to two primary things. One, the huge degree of biological individuality that exists within androgen use. So one person's 0.5 milligram per kilogram is not another person's. And also risk to reward factor. And actually, I'll slip in a third one, just a basic needs analysis.
Yes.
My 120-pound bikini girl does not need the anabolic expression that additional androgens will bring at the levels of body fat that she's coming in to maintain all of her muscle size. My let's say my over 50s figure competitor probably needs more.
That makes complete sense. So in other ways or other practices for enhancement, instead of using AAS, since we have this sort of last option, what else can we do to stimulate growth, I guess, for females? So
growth is, when we look at all the different metabolic pathways, I mentioned a term briefly there, which was needs analysis, and growth / i.e. anabolism is one that many metabolic pathways could be contributory towards. And then we could look at lipolysis if the goal is fat loss, or we could look at anti-lipogenesis if the goal is minimizing fat gain in a surplus. You can look at yourself and your needs and decide which way you're going to go about that. But there's many crossovers that have, when stacked upon one another, have many meaningful effects to each approach. If I elucidate that in a way that maybe makes sense, if we look at something like PPAR modulation, let's just say what it would do to glucose disposal or what it would do to fat oxidation, it may sort of in a vacuum look like the most suitable deployment for lipolysis, but maybe if we could create some meaningful PPAR modulation over an extended off season, our P ratios, the amount of whatever substrate we're consuming gets into the muscle cell or the fat cell is going to skew to preference the muscle cell. If we're talking about a professional, then that's going to be a meaningful change. And if there's something that is tolerable over a multi-month / multi-year time frame, hey, the cumulative effect is important. And that's a discussion point really worth sticking a pin on in women, is that many men structure their drug dosing over very short periods of time, looking for large net effects, blast and cruise or whatever. For women, you need to really just move the needle a little bit on those transcription factors like a little bit more anabolism or a little bit more lipolysis, but then stretch that over extended periods of time. That's the best model for sure.
Yeah. So
sorry, I didn't even answer your question there on that sort of diatribe. So yeah, there's lots of other metabolic pathways. Like I could just spit them at you, like beta adrenergic receptor activity through things like Clenbuterol that has mostly meaningful lipolytic effects, but also some anti-catabolic and anabolic effects.
Yep.
Growth hormone, insulin, PPAR, like we mentioned, via something like telmisartan, metformin. The list really goes on.
Yeah, it does. This is why I wanted to sort of bring it up, because I feel like you're probably one of the better people to speak to when it comes to this sort of stuff, because it is I guess, what we deem safer type use. Again, never being 100% safe. We can try and make it as safe as possible. When it comes to these other pathways, do you have a preference that you like to sort of start with? So like you said about your needs analysis, also based on what the person has access to, do you have a preference, for, let's say, a new person coming in versus, very, very experienced? It could be the same category. Let's take bikini, for example. You have somebody that's, completely new and novice coming in, wanting to obviously, give it everything and wanting to potentially even go pro, versus already someone that is pro. Like, is it a similar approach? Is it, even though there is individuality, is it a similar approach when it comes to the processes used, or are we, sort of turning it up a little bit?
Yeah, I would say when it comes to compound selection, that's basically just going to be the same in eventuality. Maybe picking the most efficacious compound for each metabolic pathway that we're discussing would be the road. But let's say for a bikini athlete that's looking to compete at some point, is not aggressively chasing a pro card, maybe we would say, okay, we're going to put something very benign in, like metformin, 500 milligrams with your last meal or whatever. Let's see what happens. Give that some time. Really wait until we stop progressing, and then maybe we'd add the next one, and we could extend that up to an angiotensin receptor blocker, or something else also very benign. Then maybe extend that up to a catalyst like injectable L-carnitine, very benign, an amino acid suspended in water. So it may be this kind of, assess, slight adjustment, go again. We pick the lowest stress. But if someone's coming to you on the cusp of a pro card that's never used PEDs, it's like, I am going to blast the shit out of this anabar. And you go, right.
Yeah, well, pretty much, because that's the one that everyone goes to, right? Like, all big, like, female competitors, I think, whether it be in sort of bodybuilding or even powerlifting, for example, on my end of the spectrum, the first and foremost is always Anova. And it's like, well, we know that there are potentially better options and potentially safer options to take. But it's like everyone's doing it, so I'm going to do it.
Yeah, and you then have to create that kind of balance, because like for sure, if you take 10 milligram of Anavar per day, you're going to get some very acute, meaningful physique improvements, or at least the massive majority of individuals are. That if you take 500 milligrams of metformin, there's no way, you're not seeing that. It's not doing that to you. So maybe we'd have to say at that point, okay, maybe we're going to have to use some growth hormone, some Clenbuterol, some telmisartan, some injectable L-carnitine, maybe a slightly above HRT dose of testosterone or something, and we would create a polypharmacy to maybe get close to the amount of anabolism that would have been driving. Yes. Which I think for many people that don't understand drug action well would sound like the more dangerous option. Why would I take that many drugs when I could just take one?
Yeah. Exactly. But people trying to understand the unique, you can stimulate other pathways to still elicit a very similar response to the pathway that's probably most dangerous or going to have the most risk to the female, right? Yeah.
So it's generally never a good idea to rev really hard on one pathway.
Mm-hmm. Completely agree.
Spread that stress over multiple systems so they never have to work so hard that they might break.
Yeah. I guess the only thing is it's probably a little bit more costly, right, when it comes to
maybe for you guys.
Yeah, in Australia, it's freaking impossible nearly these days. But when it comes to other sort of forms of female enhancement, I guess another popular one that everyone talks about are SARMs. Now, when it comes to males, obviously a little bit different, but when it comes to females, what are your sort of thoughts or feels about them?
So you're for the listeners to clarify, you're discussing non-steroidal SARMs here, which is the popular thing, because technically steroidal SARMs like primobolan and
non-steroidal, yes.
And just for clarification of the listeners again, because I know that you know this stuff, Aaron.
Yeah.
This is when we see a divorce from androgenicity and consequently a selective nature in their binding to specific tissues physiologically. So non-steroidal SARMs like RAD140 and Ostarine and whatnot. I think non-steroidal SARMs for sure are the future of clinical deployment of androgens, I suppose I should say, or androgenic / anabolic action. But we're not there yet, unfortunately. I'm not particularly a fan of non-steroidal SARMs for the most part. I think there can be efficacy in something like Ostarine at low dosages, and at least we can somewhat create predictable outcomes from human data that's been done on Ostarine, I believe up to 3 milligrams a day. So we're still talking very, very low as compared to, I know supplement shops over here that they just sell them in 20 milligram tabs. So how do we replicate that kind of outcome? It's very difficult. And I can't remember why it was abandoned. I think it was cardiovascular concern, and I think they actually changed the research area. But anyway, discussions on raising the dose to that amount that creates the meaningful outcome that you're looking for, you start to lose the tissue selectivity that you are using it for.
Yep.
If anyone wants a ramble on SARMs, or less of a ramble, I've got a lecture that's an hour long on Physique Collective that's got over 70 references on it, where I go through every single bit of data that was ever produced on non-steroidal SARMs at the time of the lecture, which was last year. There have been a few since then that aren't really worth actually digging back up. So I think Ostarine at maybe 5 milligrams a day as a means to modulate that protein turnover balance, maybe in a prep for a bikini girl, is a pretty safe deployment over maybe a 4 to 6 week period. But I wouldn't expect to see a meaningful amount of anabolism for hypertrophy processes from that kind of dosing.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess in terms of duration, obviously being very, very, dependent on the person, is there a guideline that you like to use if you were to deploy Ostarine, I guess?
Yeah, and this is a problem in the education area, is the answer everyone gives is as little time as possible. And that leaves the person knowing no more than when they ask the question. So what we do know is that duration is far more important for women than men, or actually a more specific point is duration is far more important than your acute blood androgen exposure, so your dosing.
Yes.
So if a woman came to me with the options of I'm going to run 12 weeks of 100 milligram per week or 6 weeks of 200 for the same net androgen load, I would definitely say do the 6 week, but
6 weeks, yeah.
Preferably don't do either. Now with my girls, I limit androgen exposure to 6 to 8 weeks twice a year.
Yep. And
I tend to structure that at the last part of prep, and then the final kind of big overreaching cycle of their growth macro cycle. Yeah. And there would be more use in that growth block in a total milligram than that final part of prep. Like that final part of prep, I seem to always be able to get away with about that 0.5 milligram per kilogram.
Yes.
Very rarely would you see over 30, 40 milligram per week of use there. With no issues maintaining tissue when you use all these other metabolic pathways. Because we only need to modulate that protein turnover balance so much, don't we, to basically attenuate muscle protein breakdown to the point of proteolysis not occurring, so the individual not losing muscle. Whereas in a growth phase, the additional anabolism will be contributory to the outcome of hypertrophy. So,
yeah, for sure. Which is what the whole point of the phase, right?
yeah, and it's also the whole point of the drug. These
Yeah.
drugs were created to drive protein accretion. Actually, that's not necessarily true. In muscle waste and diseases, they are for attenuating muscle protein breakdown, and some do that better than others. But really, they are to drive protein accretion.
Before we move into sort of side effects, potential side effects, and I guess issues with menstrual cycle, I just wanted to ask in terms of actual AAS selection. So you'd mentioned, bioavailable testosterone probably being the easiest or the best to use, as we can then measure androgen levels. However, again, a lot probably wouldn't want to take that, because like I was saying, most people, even most females, I guess, don't want to even inject. They want to take an oral like Anavar. Do you have a higher to low ratio of what you like to use, or like a hierarchy system in terms of AAS use that you would like to use or prefer to use with your female competitors?
Yeah, absolutely, man. So let me clarify that testosterone use briefly. So all of my female clients are competitors.
Yeah.
So when an individual competes, as you know, they go through a long duration of hypocaloric conditions, which leads to multiple hormonal axes attenuations, like sex steroid hormone attenuation. So they will see their estradiol hit the floor, their testosterone, and consequently their estradiol and their DHT. It's not somewhere that you want to be for health reasons. Like, we know that is associated with multiple increases in disease risk. And you may say, 6 weeks of being clinically low testosterone isn't so bad. Right. Okay. But add the 6 weeks the other side of the prep as well before it comes back. You've got 12 weeks. Add that to 2 shows a year. You've got 24 weeks. You've then got half a year. And then you do that for 10 years. You've got 5 years of exposure to hypocaloric conditions. So generally, all my enhanced women, I would just prefer, and this is probably not going to be a popular thing to say, but I would just prefer to have them on a HRT that inhibits that fluctuation. From a health perspective. This isn't for a physique perspective, although most certainly you will see benefits of doing so, mostly from an estradiol side of things, not seeing that. And that also, sorry to bounce about a bit, but if a woman takes Anavar to the degree that it turns off her HPO axes, I'll use some HPO variant, then they have no estradiol anyway, which is shit, So
that's kind of a problem.
I would rather have that coming from a testosterone dose than a HRT dose. Now, in some of my, let's say, quote unquote, larger females, I might have that move up to maybe what you would term like a PCOS range, maybe up to like 5 milligrams a week from 3 or something. Most of my girls are on like 3-4 milligrams a week. You have these outliers. There's a girl on the Physique Collective forums on like 9 milligrams a week, and she's got sort of mid-normal testosterone.
Of course,
biological individuality at play.
Yes,
so I'm using blood work for that and saying, okay, let's get someone like mid-upper range. We'll just leave that there. So that's how I'm not saying I don't ever use testosterone as like the growth anchor, so to speak.
Yes.
Now, so when it comes to androgens, like you said, I'm looking at data like, it sounds like I keep plugging Physique Collective, but it's only because it's
do it, man. It's a good site, and trust me, we'll be linking the site and everything.
There was a study that I put in there that was translated from German to English that was really good. That was comparing nandrolone, testosterone, masteron in terms of virilization potential. Because NPP is a very popular choice with women. I have lots of consultations like wellness, for example. I love NPP. Maybe because it's very popular with Brazilian. The team coaches, I can't stand this stuff. It's like, I have these 300 girls on my team. No one's coaching 300 people.
I agree. Yeah, I'm with you. I have this debate all the time. If someone's got 200 clients, they're not coaching clients, man.
And isn't it funny when you have a consult, they're all doing the same thing? You're like, well, so they love the MPP, but MPP was actually led to greater virilization at a lower dose than the Masteron. So, however, As a general, from various pieces of human data, I tend to just throw aside surrogate models. So for anybody listening that's not familiar with research, things on like rats and pigs and sheep, and I'm not very interested in them, just given that they don't map very well to human models. Primobolan is without question the most tolerable anabolic steroid for women in terms of virilization potential. So Primo, that's what my girls use. That's it. If they can't get Primo, which happens in some other countries, in England, it's incredibly easy. You can get,
here it's not.
Primobolan acetate, cool. We can get that. Next day, cheap, fine. If they can't get the Primobolan, I would defer to Masteron in that circumstance. And then below that, I would have things like NPP, Anavar, whatever else. But for me, I just never. I mean, it seems like anyone can get Masteron.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Masteron's quite comfortable to get versus Primobolan. It's nearly impossible these days. And again, we'd still just be using that same model we were speaking about earlier in sort of 0.5, and then if we need to titrate up per milligram per kilogram, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like I can't remember a time that I had a female use more than 75 milligrams of Primo per week, and this was a large muscular figure competitor. So.
And I guess then on the other side of the spectrum, looking at side effects of some of these things that we're talking about, or potential side effects and risks, I guess we'll start with the obvious sort of side effects of using AAS for females, and I guess effects on menstrual cycle. Sorry, go on.
No, so this is something that you can expect from any sort of exogenous hormonal input, right? This is just like hormonal birth control that women are incredibly comfortable taking. And that's not me just like throwing ethical slang out, because there is there's a lecture on Physique Collective on birth control that I've done. There's some survey studies that I reference in there where women look at birth control as just like anything that they do, just like food that they eat. It's just a benign part of their life, without realizing that they're taking an exogenous sex steroid hormone and having a negative feedback inhibition for the HPO axis, and then not having a menstrual cycle. So this is the same sort of thing. There doesn't appear to be any long-term consequences to turning off FSH and LH. We've got women in their hundreds of thousands of millions using birth control and putting themselves under the same scenario. In fact, the bit of birth control history, the withdrawal week, where you would stop taking the pill for a week, it's not a sufficient amount of time to regain HPO axis function. This was actually only ever in place to make women feel more normal.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but it's just an expected outcome, and when you drop the exogenous hormones and the HPO axis regulates normally, eventually, hopefully, if it does, depends when you come off, then you will regain luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone and GnRH secretion from the hypothalamus, and everything will kick in, and hopefully you'll be okay.
So when it does come to, I guess with males, we have this thing called PCT cycles. Do we have anything similar, or we can put anything into place for females other than the potential, 1 to 3 milligrams of like testosterone for a HRT type model?
So just to briefly touch on PCT for males, there was a recent trial that my friend Peter Bond was involved in, called the Haarlem study, HAARLEM, out of the Netherlands, I believe. It was a survey type study, but that's sufficient for what we were looking for. Bodybuilders in there, some that use PCT protocols that involve selective estrogen receptor modulators and gonadotropins and things like this, versus some that didn't and just ceased use of androgens. And actually, it appeared pretty clearly that those not using PCT protocols had a greater speed to HPG axis recovery than those that were. So my recommendation to women would be the same in that sense as men. Just cease use of the drug and allow sufficient time for your HPO axis to regulate, rather than delay the process with off-label cancer drugs.
Yeah. Have we seen, or have you ever seen, like from an anecdotal standpoint, a time frame? So it's kind of like, 10 weeks of usage, let's say, into a show versus 10 weeks post usage, in terms of, let's say, certain things coming back from a menstrual cycle point of view, or is it just sort of whatever happens? It just happens when it does.
Yeah, so assuming that that the female in question has done everything that they needed to do to regain fat mass and control nervous system inputs that also lead to amenorrhea, so maybe they're in a good place, stress management wise, sleep duration, quality wise, eat plenty of nutrient dense food in a hypercaloric condition, have regained sufficient body fat. I can't say I've ever seen a woman longer than 8 weeks post show not using long ester compound into the show. However, clearance rate that hasn't had a normal hormone panel, but the women, I shouldn't say never because I have, but the women that I see, not 12 weeks later still nothing, 16 weeks later still nothing, and this does happen, and it happens with male bodybuilders as well, where you have essentially made yourself hypogonadal. You may have been pretty close to it prior, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah, so it's like having prior issues potentially and then using enhancement. It's only just going to exacerbate it potentially, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So with other side effects, I guess, so we've sort of spoken about side effects to do with AAS use, but what about those other pathways that we were talking about in terms of, insulin, growth hormone? Are there side effects potentially to female and like females, physique athletes, I guess?
Just briefly on side effects with androgens, I think a point worth noting for women as well, that less so than men, things like renal toxicity and neurotoxicity or hepatic toxicity and stuff is not such a huge concern because the effective dosages for women are so low.
Yeah.
So when it comes to side effects, we're talking virilization with women, and as long as you use these drugs properly, it pretty much starts and ends there. With the virilization potential, and for anybody that doesn't know, that's just masculinization, deepening of the voice,
some body hair,
terminal hair growth, stuff like that. You don't see. You should say you don't see. We've had quite a few women die in the sport recently, so I suppose you do see. At least I don't see women with these like organ pathologies.
Yeah, well, I was thinking of touching on diuretics, but I thought maybe I'll leave it for another conversation for another day.
We can talk diuretics for sure, man, because I peak a load of competitors, alongside my own clients. Something that I'm like, without tooting my own horn, pretty well known for is peaking people as well. I've peaked so many competitors this year, and I've not used a single diuretic. And that's not I don't want to, what do they call it? That's not virtue signaling. I would just like to make people aware that it does happen in the pro ranks. Not everyone's using a diuretic and you don't have to. And it's not saying that I don't push diuresis.
Yes, there's a difference. Yeah,
because I certainly do. I would involve some kind of water and sodium manipulation, which can be just as dangerous.
Yes.
In the wrong hands. That's a strange argument. I think either can be dangerous. They're probably less potential given the control you have over the situation. But anyway, sorry, I'm drawing away from your question. So
that's all right.
Side effects of things like growth hormone and insulin and whatnot. So insulin, we're talking very acute potential side effects, although this is a drug that's dangerous, extremely overblown. We're talking about a drug that is like prescribed to insulin-dependent type 1 diabetic children. Like especially if you've got a functioning pancreas, like how dangerous insulin is benign. If you look at the LD50, for somebody that doesn't know, LD50 means lethal dose 50. So the dose you would have to take to kill about 50% of the individuals using this dose of Lantus insulin is 1,000 units, which is more than 3 whole pens. So unless somehow like you slipped and fell and landed on 4 pens and then managed to turn the dials all the way
up
to 300, I don't think the diet even goes.
No, I was going to say I don't think they do either.
and then not eat anything, and then literally fall asleep.
Yeah.
You're okay. Right? So yeah, there's the acute possibility of blood glucose dropping and you being hypoglycemic, and then it's pretty much as simple as consuming some form of glucose intensive food. Eating some carbohydrate of sorts. That's not really something that I'm thinking about insulin. I mean, yeah, chronic exposure to high levels of blood insulin will lead to insulin resistance. So it's quite a double-edged sword, because proper use of basal insulin types will lead to what's the best way to describe it? Insulin resistance being further away than it typically would be in an overfeeding scenario.
Yes.
So proper use of a basal insulin will take some stress off of the pancreas. Being hyperinsulinemic on like a 24-hour basis would lead to some degree of insulin resistance. So I suppose that would be the primary concern with the side effect. Growth hormone a little bit different. So growth hormone, IGF is the reason why we would use growth hormone for the most part in an anabolism scenario. Mm-hmm. In a fat loss scenario, not really at all. We're talking about mobilizing free fatty acids, but when it comes to growth hormone, we're talking IGF-1, in which there's multiple isoforms: endocrine, autocrine, paracrine. Endocrine IGF, I've seen no data to suggest has any contributory factor towards anabolism. And it's the IGF that we don't really want. This is like systemic, whole body IGF, but you can't avoid it. It increases. There's a linear increase with bolus dosing of growth hormone. So as a general suggestion, microdosing growth hormone would be a preference, but it's pretty clear that the mammals with the highest blood IGF die the earliest, but it also correlates that they're also the largest mammals. So
yeah, exactly.
Which one, so correlation isn't always causation, but it does seem that systemic IGF-1 increases in systemic IGF-1 or high serum systemic IGF-1 is associated with a lower lifespan. Note associated with, and there's some tumor cell lines that are also proliferated by systemic IGF, but there's multiple. So people say I don't want to use growth hormone in case I get cancer or something. I think that's probably a bit of a stretch.
Well, I guess then off the back of that, using IGF-1 as its own peptide or its own, again, a lot of people that don't want to take growth hormone or find that it's just expensive, because it is, then always try to use fragments and always try to, revert to peptides and, IGF-1 being one of the big ones, or IGF. So again, is it doing what it would do in human growth hormone, or is it completely different?
My problem with IGF as a peptide is its lack of binding proteins.
Yeah.
So, and especially, the odd thing that people do is inject IGF locally into tissues. And if you imagine you have a physiological amount of IGF-BP3, so where the IGF actually will bind and transcribe its anabolism is just not there. It has to leave the tissue anyway, but even beyond that point, it has to be pulled into the blood before it can bind anywhere in the first place.
Yes.
So it is just going to go systemic.
Yeah.
I don't see efficacy in something like Increlex. There is a product called iPlex that seems more promising, which is IGF-1 and IGF-BP3 combined.
Yes.
But even then, I think we're still talking about systemic IGF-1 with no human data, especially not on hypertrophy. And then my question kind of becomes like, is this not enough?
Yeah, fair.
Is growth hormone and insulin combined to drive local IGF-1 factors? Like, is that really not potent enough for you?
It's a fair question, right?
Given that they're both drugs that are in like current human deployment, And I'm not particularly interested in like what the most potent thing is, more so like what can I use for long durations and have pretty good predictable outcomes with.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm not a fan of research chemicals and things like this.
Yeah. And look, it makes complete sense. And again, take a very similar approach, especially working with yourself for nearly a year and a half now. So it's a very, very similar mindset. Just quickly touching on any other side effects, I guess, from any of the other, I guess, pathways we can use. So we've sort of covered AAS, IGF, insulin, growth. Trying to think if there's anything else.
Side effects, a common one I come across that people shit themselves at, pun intended, is metformin.
Yeah.
So what metformin does to gut microbiome, and many people do know this antimicrobial effect when they take metformin. That's usual, like, Joe, I've had diarrhea all day. And it's like, okay, give it a couple of days. Probably a good thing. You probably don't have a great microbiota in the gut. So that's pretty common from metformin, like GI upset very acutely, and is associated with positive outcomes. Like if you look at what metformin does to, let's say, individuals that express these gut microbiome that interact with short chain fatty acids, for example, or gut microbiome that drive overfeeding.
Yes.
There's some really cool things with metformin. That's the main hypothesis as to why metformin is associated with anti-aging. What metformin does to the gut, that's pretty common. In proper dosing schemes, things like growth hormone, telmisartan, injectable L-carnitine, even thyroid drugs, you should not be seeing some side effects. You'd have to be absolutely taking a piss.
Yeah.
Clenbuterol and yohimbine as stimulants to some degree would certainly see some side effects, like tremors with clenbuterol, potentially some cramps and things like that. And
some acute side effects.
Yeah, but we're not talking about like ventricular remodeling or something like this at the dosages that we, in fact, generally quite the opposite with clenbuterol, right? There's been some egregious dosages used in trials like the Hatfield protocol. What's that?
Yes.
720 micrograms a day.
Yeah. It's a bit extreme.
In patients with heart failure,
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe some.
So that is always a funny one. People that freak out clenbuterol saying that it's bad for your heart. It's kind of like, well, there was this study.
Yeah. And I think clenbuterol is also maybe more potent than people realize. I remember actually the last conversation I had with John Meadows was we were talking about this study on 80 micrograms of clenbuterol. You'll have seen it increasing rest and energy expenditure. What was it? Like,
yes.
12% or something.
Maybe didn't you wrote an article on it on your website way back, didn't you?
I did. Yeah.
I remember reading it.
Yeah, I did. And John sent me a message about it. And so that'll always stick in my head. So, very, very potent effects from something that, again, is in human clinical practice at those dosages.
Yeah. It's like, it baffles me that, I guess, sort of the bro type lifters and people in the gym will always sort of say something and it just sticks. The amount of clients or consults that I've had where, I suggest a certain way to go about things, multiple pathway type stuff. And they're just sort of like, well, isn't this bad? Isn't that bad? Well, it's like, why? Can you give me a reason as to why it's bad? Oh, because that guy, my mate, told me. It's like, well, your mate's a twat. Yeah. So
or this is what everyone does, or this is what everyone's done. But luckily we're in a position now that is changing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why I wanted to have this conversation, because most like female enhancement here anyway, they always refer, or most of the time refer to Annabelle. So whether it's, whether it's getting on stage or whether it's getting on the platform for powerlifting, it seems to be one drug fits all. And as we know, it's not the case at all.
Yeah, I suppose powerlifting is a hard one. I'm not a specialist in powerlifting by any means. I would never claim to be one. But you're talking about neurological impact there, aren't you? Which androgens are pretty good at driving force production and things like that. I suppose a lot of powerlifters look to things like Masteron there, or Superdrol, or these. Yeah. I wonder if women would drive more towards neurological input from like choline donation or high stimulants, or I don't know.
Just take some modafinil on the day and you'll be right.
That's it. Yeah. If you're not, then you'll still get lots of other stuff done.
Exactly right. I was just going to say the last sort of thing to touch on in terms of actual fertility and I guess menstrual cycle. Are there? Oh, okay. That's a bad question. The potential issues that arise from using AAS. Are there ways to mitigate as much as we can, or is it sort of sometimes it's just going to happen and you just shit out of luck?
No, in the same way that birth control works, sending negative feedback inhibition to the hypothalamus, if you use a sufficient amount of these drugs, is going to do the same thing. I suppose you could, I've never thought about this in women. I suppose you could use drugs that are used to drive spermatogenesis in men, like Clomid or HCG, because they're in clinical practice in females as well.
Yes.
So that's a potential. Do you know what? I've never had this scenario.
Well, that's all. I was thinking more along the lines of, I wonder if what happens to females that are sort of using both birth control as well as enhancement practices.
Oh, that's simple. I've had a lot of these women. So generally, you'll either have a progesterone only hormonal contraceptive or a combination estrogen progesterone, and it's just another hormone to factor in. In fact, it's like, if we've got that estrogen in there, great. Not a particular fan of progesterone, and I could tell you why if you want. everything that it does sucks. So everything from it's like cross binding to other receptors. Like if you're using a progesterone estrogen pill and you take androgens, there's definitely a discussion to be had that progesterone can cross bind to the androgen receptor and occupy that.
Yes.
Although androgens, as we know, do upregulate in the presence of additional androgens, so I'm not sure at what degree that would affect things. Synthetic progesterone can bind at the cortisol receptor as well, and send a weak cortisol signal, which reduces cortisol signaling, which you could then say, well, hey, less cortisol signaling, then less muscle protein breakdown potentially, which is another benefit. The problem with progesterone is there's issues like inducing body fat storage in the lower body primarily, which is why it activates an enzyme. I can't remember the name of it, but I just remember this research paper that I read coining it the female storage enzyme. It induces insulin resistance as well. So it increases the use of intramuscular triglycerides, which is a bad thing, because like how growth hormone induces insulin resistance is by mobilizing fat from adipocytes. Yes. Which is a good thing. It's like good insulin resistance, right? But this is the bad one. Also for a woman on PrEP, like progesterone is very, very directly associated with increasing hunger and cravings. There's a study that showed the increase of progesterone in the luteal phase caused an increase of energy intake up to 500 calories a day ad libitum. So, and it blocks estrogen's effects on skeletal tissue, skeletal muscle remodeling as well. Yes. So yeah, just a terrible choice.
So basically, just don't use it.
Well, if you're using androgens, what are you trying to do? Yeah, you've already inhibited negative feedback inhibition. Cool. Yes.
Yeah, it's a waste of time.
Yeah, you've already turned off the system that was turning off. Although progesterone, it's not. Progesterone is the most tried and true method of hormonal birth control. That's pretty well understood, and not all women will be able to take HRT doses of testosterone and see a sufficient decrease in LH or FSH. So that would be a blood work thing,
Yeah, for sure. Well, man, to finish up, I tend to ask one question pretty straightforward, but it seems to be quite a few people have a problem with it. But it's literally just 3 Instagram accounts that you follow for personal use really that either make you feel better, make you feel good, happy, you learn from, anything that has a positive influence on you from day to day. I know you don't really scroll much, but you sort of just jump on,
I make
check all your notifications.
Yeah, I make a point of not doing Instagram. I'll do three that make me happy, right?
Yeah, go on.
Okay, so alongside bodybuilding, my love is IPG dog sports.
Yep.
So I'll shout out the my mentor in the dog world for anybody that's got dogs, at Blackjack Canine UK.
Yep.
That's Mr. Ross Heron, the best in the game at sports training, protection training, whatnot. I think that's the first time I've shouted out a dog. I'll also say at Physique Collective, because that's my family. They're all my boys, you know, all my best friends at Physique Collective. We've got our members site with videos on anything you can imagine. We've got PED videos, nutrition videos, cooking videos, training videos.
So we'll definitely be linking it for you, man. It's such a good site. It's such a good site. Well,
you know, we've got a really good month coming up. We've just had the app built. The app's finished. We're
waiting for it finally.
Yeah, so tomorrow morning I've got a walkthrough with the app developer where he's taking me through everything. There's some really cool stuff on there, man. And then we've got like exercise library coming to that as well. We've just hired someone else, Physique Collective, to do that. And the exercise library is not going to be like, here's to do a lap focus row. No. We've commissioned, if you've got a life fitness row, here's your video. If you've got a Cybex row, yeah, nice. If you've got the prime row, man. So, you know, sort of a lot of work on that. So there's two. Third one that makes me smile. Do you know what? I'm going to shout out my wife's company here, Compact. They ship to Australia. She's got Australian, right? So I'm pretty sure it's at Compact Women for the female side. And what they do, at Compact Women, what they do is supply bodybuilding and bikini competition essentials. So shoes, skin prep, tan, robes, bikini bike, everything, plastic cups, shiwis, everything, hair removal stuff, everything you need for your show day, go to Compact.
Beautiful. I like it. Thank you, good sir, for jumping on the podcast. And I'm sure we will have you on again soon. Thanks, guys and girls, for listening.